Welcome back to Big Law University, where we make learning the law simple for you. Today we're going to be covering criminal procedure, and we're going to be talking about the Fourth Amendment and the requirement of government action. So the purpose of this presentation is twofold. First, it provides a broad structural overview of the Fourth Amendment so that its role in criminal procedure is clearly understood before engaging with specific doctrines. And the second, it explains a threshold condition that must be satisfied before the Fourth Amendment applies at all, namely the requirement that the challenged conduct constitutes government action. So the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution provides in full that the right of the people to be secure in their persons, their houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not, what did I say? Shall or shall not? Beautiful lady in the back?
Not.
Shall not be violated. And that no warrants shall issue except upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. This language reflects a deliberate effort to restrain governmental power. The amendment is not symbolic, nor is it aspirational. It is operational. It defines when the government may intrude into private life, and more importantly, when it may not. Every phrase matters because each phrase limits discretion. The amendment exists because history demonstrated that an unchecked authority inevitably produces abuse, and the framers designed this provision to impose restriction on the exercise of state power. The Fourth Amendment limits the government's ability to intrude upon, confiscate, detain the physical person or property of private citizens. It is foundational to criminal procedure because law enforcement cannot investigate crimes without searching property, seizing items, or detaining individuals. Without the Fourth Amendment, there would be no constitutional boundary governing how investigations are conducted. In practical terms, the Fourth Amendment does not prevent law enforcement from doing its job. Instead, it regulates the manner in which that job is performed. It recognizes that intrusion is sometimes necessary, but insists that the intrusion be justified, specific, and reasonable. The amendment does not exist to protect guilt or innocent. It exists to discipline the exercise of authority. When the United States was first founded, the protections of the Bill of Rights applied only to the federal government. State and local governments were not constitutionally bound by those provisions unless state law independently imposed similar constraints. And this changed in the mid-20th century when the Supreme Court began incorporating many of the Bill of Rights protections through the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. As a result of this incorporation doctrine, the Fourth Amendment now applies with equal force to the federal, state, and local government actors. This development closed a major loophole. It eliminated the possibility that constitutional rights would depend on which level of government happened to be acting. Today, law enforcement authority is constrained by the same constitutional baseline, regardless of whether the badge is federal, state, or local. The Fourth Amendment affects criminal investigation and prosecution in two critical ways. First, it governs how law enforcement officers investigate crimes and arrest suspects. Second, it determines whether physical evidence obtained by police may be introduced against a defendant at trial. In many cases, the admissibility of evidence determines the outcome of the prosecution itself. This is where the amendment becomes decisive. Evidence may be reliable, incriminating, and decisive. But if it was obtained in violation of the Fourth Amendment, it may never reach the jury. The Constitution prioritizes lawful process over expedient results. Courts do not ask only whether the evidence proves guilt. They ask how the government obtained it. It is important to distinguish the Fourth Amendment from other constitutional protections. The Fourth Amendment primarily governs searches and seizures of persons and property. The admissibility of a defendant's statements is governed by the Fifth, Sixth, and 14th Amendments. Confusing these doctrinal domains leads to analytical errors and incorrect conclusions. In Weeks versus the United States, the Supreme Court confronted a widespread pattern of federal officers obtaining physical evidence through unconstitutional means. The court concluded that the only effective way to enforce the Fourth Amendment was to exclude unlawfully obtained evidence from trial. This judicially created a remedy became known as the exclusionary rule. What rule was that?
Exclusionary.
The exclusionary rule is not a personal right and is not designed to compensate defendants. Its purpose is institutional. It removes incentives for unlawful conduct by rendering illegal obtained evidence unusable. The rule applies even when the evidence would otherwise satisfy ordinary evidentiary standards. The exclusionary rule was later applied to the states through the 14th Amendment in Mapp versus Ohio. While these states are free to provide greater protections than those required by the Fourth Amendment, they may not provide less. This establishes a national constitutional floor beneath which the state criminal procedure may not fall. Before any Fourth Amendment analysis can begin, however, a threshold requirement must be satisfied. The Fourth Amendment applies only to unreasonable searches and seizures conducted by the government. It does not apply to purely private conduct. So let me repeat that again because you weren't paying attention, beautiful lady back there. The Fourth Amendment applies only to unreasonable searches and seizures conducted by who?
Remind me.
By the government. It does not apply to purely private conduct. If there is no government action, the Fourth Amendment is not implicated, regardless of how intrusive or objectionable the private conduct may be. This limitation is absolute. The Constitution restrains government power, not private behavior. As a result, evidence obtained by private individuals acting entirely on their own initiative is generally admissible, even if the same conduct would have violated the Fourth Amendment had it been performed by law enforcement. Now, this distinction between private action and government action is not always straightforward. Government action is plainly present when public officials act in their official capacities, but private individuals may also be treated as government actors when they function as instruments or agents of the government. Whether this occurs depends on the degree of governmental participation in the private conduct. Courts examine several factors when determining whether a private individual's actions should be attributed to the government. These include the extent of government knowledge, encouragement, direction, or acquiescence, as well as the private individual's motivation. A person acting primarily to advance governmental interests, particularly in expectation of compensation or continued cooperation, is more likely to be deemed a government action. In general, when a private individual acting for private reasons obtains evidence and later turns it over to law enforcement, a snitch, the evidence is admissible because the government did nothing wrong in obtaining it. However, a private search may be transformed into governmental search if law enforcement significantly exceeds the scope of the initial private intrusion. An example illustrates these principles. Suppose an airline baggage handler employed by a private airline encounters a suspicious luggage and opens it on his own initiative, discovering all of your illegal drugs. At that point, there is no government action and the evidence is admissible if turned over to the police. If additional facts show that the baggage handler has a long-standing relationship with law enforcement as a paid informant, regularly searches similar luggage with the expectation of a reward, and acts solely to assist government investigations, the analysis changes. Under those circumstances, courts may conclude that the individual functioned as an agent of the government. In such a case, the Fourth Amendment applies and the legality of the search must be evaluated accordingly. This distinction reflects a core principle of constitutional law. The government may not evade constitutional limits by acting indirectly through private actors. When private conduct is sufficiently intertwined with government objectives and participation, the Constitution treats that conduct as public action. So, in summary, the Fourth Amendment regulates the government's power to search and seize persons and property. The exclusionary rule enforces that limitation by rendering unlawfully obtained evidence inadmissible. Before either doctrine applies, however, there must be government action. Understanding this threshold requirement is essential because without government action, the Fourth Amendment has no role to play. Thank you for attending class. Class is dismissed, and we'll see you in the next video.